Doing? Have a seat. Very quiet. We ready? Okay. Well, good evening and welcome to always beautiful Riggs Library, but now it's very festive tonight. So it's even more wonderful tonight. So glad you all are here. Center on Faith and Justice Georgetown has a continuing series called Higher Calling, in which we talk to our nation's political leaders about the role of religion and ethics in their professional and their personal lives. It's really directed at students like you. I'm glad to see so many students tonight. And welcome to those watching online. There's lots of folks watching us tonight. We welcome you as well. As you seek your vocations here at Georgetown, this is the kind of night where you can get some help with all of that. And we are very fortunate, in my tradition, I would say we are blessed to be joined tonight by my good friend, Senator Chris Coons. Let's give him some love here. Now, I could say a lot about Chris, but let me just say Chris Coons was elected to the United States Senate from Delaware in 2010. In the Senate, he sits on the Appropriations, Judiciary, Foreign Relations, and Ethics Committees, among others, right? So, all important posts which show how much his colleagues in the Senate on both sides of the aisle, I want to say, both sides of the aisle, appreciate his intellectual and political gifts, and I think because he's a good listener. He listens to people. He doesn't just talk all the time, as some do up there. Senator Coons earned his law degree from Yale Law School, while simultaneously earning a master's degree in ethics from Yale Divinity School at the same time. I enjoy a lot of relationships up there in the Hill, but this one I particularly enjoy. This one I would call a friendship. And I'm blessed to have my friend here. I often kid my friend that he was the only theologian senator that I knew until Raphael Warnock won in 2020, the Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock. So Chris Coons is prepared for a conversation like tonight. He's a public servant who knows what the phrase higher calling means. So we are blessed, I'll say it again, to have him here with us tonight. So thanks for coming to Georgetown.
Thanks, Jim. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for pressing for me to make the space and time to be in this gorgeous library at this great center and with all of you this evening. Thank you for your intention, engagement, and interest. And thanks for this next chapter in your leadership in our country. For decades, I read Sojourners, and I listened to or watched or read Jim Wallace's work and was moved and challenged by it. He has for a very long time been a critical voice in our nation about the intersection of values, faith, morality, and politics. And I didn't know there was such a voice when a friend first said to me, "Have you read Sojourners? Have you looked at this? Do you know this community?" And it had a dramatic impact on me. So thank you for decades of leadership. And I'm thrilled at this new center that you're leading, and at the McCourt School and at Georgetown for hosting not just this conversation, but for being a place close to the Capitol in the coming years, where conversations like this will hopefully be commonplace, not rare.
Let's hope so. We're a tag team. We're going to be a tag team here tonight. So you grew up attending, I love this, Red Clay Creek Presbyterian Church.
That's it.
In Wilmington, Delaware, and were later ordained as an elder there. You've written that the church had an active congregation, a strong youth ministry, meaningful mission work, and preaching, solid preaching.
Solid preaching.
Tell us more about your Presbyterian youth, and how did it form your conscience and what you care about and how you make meaning of things?
You're going to have to cut me off. Don't let me go on too long. But I didn't really understand the position of Presbyterianism within the Reformed Christian tradition until I went to div school. We had a really good Sunday school, but they didn't get into Calvinism and the roots of predestination and the specifics. What I knew was that we went to church every Sunday. My mom and dad were both active. My dad taught Sunday school. My mom volunteered with the women's group. There was a great youth group that I participated in. I was indifferent, difficult, acted up, didn't pay much attention. But I absorbed through action what my parents' faith meant to them. And I didn't really process all this until I was a parent myself. My mom, along with a dozen other moms in the congregation, welcomed a Vietnamese refugee family. I thought everybody grew up with a refugee family that you were really close to. This was at the end of the Vietnam War. There were thousands who ended out on the sea on boats and rafts and were picked up by the U.S. Navy and were relocated as refugees. And my mom never talked about this being, I'm putting my faith into action. She just got busy getting to work, welcoming the family of Vien Tran. They had an incredible story. Mr. Vien had served in the Army of South Vietnam, had been taken to a re-education camp when South Vietnam fell. His family went 1,000 miles away to a refugee camp in Thailand. He ultimately escaped from the re-education camp and walked across Cambodia to Thailand, and they were reunited in a refugee camp. I've never met a harder working man. He had an elementary school education. All 5 of his children ended up going to college and graduate school, being professionals and business owners and community leaders, and they were the same age as my older brother, younger brother, and me. We were right next to each other. That was mission work in the best sense that I didn't understand was motivated by my mother's faith. My father, we had a visiting pastor come one Sunday who was from the prison, from the state prison, and he ran Bible studies and reflection groups with convicts, with folks who were in prison for the long haul. And he at one point said, is there anybody here, anybody who will volunteer to come to Smyrna with me and help these men in prison? And my dad's hand went, he's like, what the heck? And he surprised himself by volunteering. And he ended up going to Smyrna prison and developing a close friendship with someone named Paul, who really kept himself, who didn't participate, who wasn't active or engaged with the rest. He'd murdered his father. His father was horrifically abusive to his mother. His father was an alcoholic who beat his mother right in front of him for years. And he kept saying to his father, when I get old enough, if you don't stop doing this, I'm going to kill you. He killed his father, picked up the phone, called the police and said, come pick me up. I just killed my father. I'll never hurt anybody else, but I did this because he was hurting my mother. And when I was 11 or 12, my father took me with him to Smyrna State Prison to go visit Paul. And I just thought this was normal. I thought everybody grew up going to prison and visiting prisoners with their dad. But then he started bringing Paul home to our house on furlough weekends. And only when I was a parent did I reflect on the fact that with 3 young boys at home, my dad brought a convicted murderer into our home for weekends, for us to go fishing and visit and talk with him. Years later, when he was released, I had a chance to visit with Paul. And he said that the kindness and trust my father showed in him changed his life and changed the trajectory of his life. My father would be surprised that I'm talking about this today. He passed a couple of years ago. But that had an enormous impact on me, that he took that risk for someone he had no connection to. And for both my parents, those actions were the ones that taught the most to me about defining who is your neighbor and broadening the circle of concern beyond folks, you know, who maybe speak the same language as you or look like you or have the same background as you or have the same life trajectory as you. And that was because of the faith of our church. Now, Jeff Flake, who was a senator and is now an ambassador, was a Mormon missionary. And he and I ended up in Southern Africa at the same time. I worked for the South Africa Council of Churches. He was doing his Mormon mission. And when he and I went back to Southern Africa as senators, I said to him once, we were on a long flight, I said, Jeff, I've never understood this. How could you, from Arizona, get on a plane, go to Zimbabwe, go to a hut of someone you've never met, speaking a language you don't know, and go, hi, I want to talk about Jesus. And he looks at me and he says, so what is it your people do? And I said, Presbyterians run around the world building hospitals and schools and visiting prisoners and helping refugees, but we don't ever talk about Jesus because, that would be a lot. And he looked me right in the eyes and he said, if you believe that salvation is possible through a belief in Jesus, and that's the most important thing you could share with someone, ever. It's the greatest gift you could ever give anyone. If you believe that, why would you never talk about it? And I still don't have an answer for him. Mm-hmm. And each of us have been challenging the other in the years since. Him to be maybe a little more action and a little less witness, and me to be a little more witness and a little less action. But that was the foundation of a relationship, of a friendship of trust with someone who's a genuine conservative that led to some really important work that we did together. That was a long-winded explanation of the impact of my childhood church, but I hope it illuminated a little bit.
Hey, so your parents were active church people, but as you just said, they really took Jesus' words in Matthew 25, a text that you and I have often talked about, where he instructed us to care for the sick, the stranger, the prisoner, and the hungry. So they actually did this, and you watched them do it.
Yes. My mother went and served lunch at Emmanuel Dining Room to folks who were homeless. And never, there was no, they were joyful. There was never a sense of, look at me, look at what I'm doing. They were quiet. They were largely anonymous. When I said my father would be surprised I'm talking about this, I don't think he would want me making a big deal. He didn't think it was a big deal. He thought he was just doing what you're
That's
supposed
what Christians
just
do.
doing what you're supposed to do and not make some big deal about it and run around going, look at me, I'm making a difference. My wife spends 3 or 4 days a week vaccinating in prison, caring for sex workers, helping folks who are fentanyl drug addicts, and she spent Sunday at Adams Ford, which is a really tough corner in downtown Wilmington. So tough, I was like, I'm really nervous about your safety. She's like, oh, stop it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And that kind of quiet, humble service challenges me because I'm in a career where hanging a lantern on what you do is given higher priority than what you actually get done.
So that's a legacy. You got a legacy from your mom and your dad that you carried on. Legacy is an important word for us all here. So I was intrigued. Both of us have been in South Africa, impacted our lives deeply. You met people like Desmond Tutu. What did you learn from African Christians when you were there and people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu?
So as Jeff remembers well, maybe, I spent a semester in Kenya my junior year in college.
Yeah.
And it transformed my view of life, the world, America's place in the world.
Yeah.
And I lived with several different families. Their radical hospitality, the extent to which they were just unbelievably kind, welcoming, faithful. We prayed over everything. We prayed over breakfast. We prayed over lunch. We prayed that the bus would come on time. We prayed that the chicken would have an egg. I mean, we prayed for everything. I'd never been in households where we prayed like 10 times a day for everything. And the longer I spent with that main family I lived with in Nairobi, the more I got it. And it genuinely challenged a lot of my ideas about exceptionalism, about the West, about some of my political views. And frankly, South Africa was even more transformational. I was there at the height of the anti-apartheid movement when the regime had imposed a state of emergency. I was supposed to stay with a Presbyterian pastor in Cape Town, and I showed up at her house, and the secret police had dragged her out midnight in front of her kids screaming the night before. And I met with her very traumatized husband, and I ended up having to stay with a pastor who took me in. I am still friends today with Bishop Paul Vereen, who I lived with in South Africa at the time, who's lived in Soweto for decades, who's as much of a thorn in the side of the ANC government as he was of the apartheid regime, but was an unbelievable example to me of risking everything in the service of justice.
So let's go back to the political thing. You said you had a conversion, in a sense, a political one, not a religious one, from Republican to Democrat after your experience in Africa.
Yeah.
What was it that led to your political conversion in Africa, from Africa?
It's a long conversation, and I'll just try and be brief. So trying to defend what was then the Reagan administration's policy towards South Africa in debates with students at the University of Nairobi was really hard.
Constructive engagement.
I couldn't
you call
explain
it.
or defend
Right.
America's position.
Right.
And that began a much longer journey. I had a college debate partner who's now Father Tom Massaro at Fordham, who's a Jesuit theologian. And he was doing a mission year in Jamaica when I was in Kenya. And he picked me up at JFK when I landed, drove me to the South Bronx. We got out, walked around, and he said, explain this. You tell me how your Reagan Republican view of opportunity in America, like you tell me how this is just and how this is the logical result of a good and kind system. And we had an argument that lasted most of a year. But I had the blessing of a lot of good friends, Jeff Urbach among them, who kept gently, persistently prodding, poking. I had two friends on my freshman dorm who are today rabbis and who were so gracious and put up with a lot of nonsense for me. And instead of shutting me down or canceling me, like drew me out and said, well, why do you think that? Well, how does that make you feel? Well, I've often wondered if Ted Cruz had two folks on his hall as good as Barry and Hera, who had worked with him instead of just being like, you're wrong and judging him.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to make fun of Senator Cruz, but I went to college as confident in my conservatism and republicanism as I suspect Senator Cruz did. And I was greeted by people who gave me the room to actually debate with them and discuss what are my views, not what did I absorb from popular media, what did I think was the right thing, what did I pick up from my friends in high school, but what did I actually believe? Bread for the World was an organization that had a real impact on me as a young man. Amnesty International had a real impact on me as a young man. So did a dozen other organizations I had a chance to work with, the Coalition for the Homeless, the I Have a Dream Foundation. I met good people of a wide range of backgrounds who were trying to make a difference in the world. And the common thread across many of them was faith, was a sense of our place in the world and a sense that everybody has some spark of the divine in them and is worthy of a common respect.
So what you saw people doing, what you saw them living, and what was underneath all of that was very powerful in your life. And that led to, it sounds like there was a moral conversion going on. And it led, in your case, also to a political conversion because people listened to you and talked to you and didn't just point fingers at you.
I'd say that was a piece of it, was the generosity and kindness of spirit,
Yeah.
undeserved, that I experienced. And then a growing sense of, shame's probably a strong word, but in a Catholic institution, why not? A growing sense of shame at ways in which I had mistreated others or been obnoxious or been aggressive or been inconsiderate. Or it took a couple of years for that to really grow on me.
Right.
But I became clearer that humility, generosity, patience, grace were higher values than aggression,
Right.
accumulation,
Indeed.
self-aggrandizement.
As you know, I've always been intrigued by your Yale Law School and Yale Duke School at the same time. And you said that most of your friends in law school were quite progressive.
Yeah.
And they did not take kindly to your decision to enroll in the divinity school. In fact, I've heard some disowned you. You had roommates move out. Others stopped talking to you. What was behind these reactions, and how has the progressive movement, in your experience, become more or less hostile to religion since then?
And that was a painful chapter. I'll be brief. I discovered a group of friends in law school who were people weren't part of my sort of. I spent a lot of time in the homelessness and housing clinic in law school.
Okay.
And became close friends with a great group of tough, bright, aggressive progressive litigators who were fighting hard for people's rights. But I also fell in with a prayer group of about a dozen law students who came from a wide range of religious backgrounds, but were trying to figure out the role of faith in their lives. And we met regularly, and we'd spend an hour or two praying together as a group. And roommates of mine and friends of mine, classmates of mine, thought that was just weird. And were increasingly hostile and negative about. As I got quite active in my church, and I was working at a homeless shelter in New Haven, and I felt a very strong calling to understand and explore my faith. And there's a lot of other things I could have confessed to my close circle of friends, and they would have been like, oh, that's great. But saying that I was actually a Christian, that I actually believed in Jesus Christ, that I actually read Scripture, that was too much for quite a few of them. And that was a very painful period for me.
We have this seminary program in the summer intensive week. I call it the Underground Seminary. We bring seminarians here. And we had a session up on the hill. Nancy Pelosi was there, who was in that seat last time we did this. You were there. And I remember the students asked, why don't you Democrats talk more about faith? You're doing it here because we're with you, but why don't you talk more about faith in public? Because sometimes people think only Republicans are the religious ones, because you all don't talk about faith. And you had a great answer to their question. And you talked about why, in fact, it's important to talk about what motivates you, what undergirds you, what's behind it, and not just do it, but say why.
An important thing for us to recognize in any conversation is that there is a significant amount of trauma in our society over both organized religion and how it has fallen short or failed or even victimized some people in our society, and the assumptions or projections that some put on when you say, I'm a person of faith.
Sure.
There's some two-dimensional, cartoonish characterizations that folks then project on you and say, oh, well, then that means you believe this or this or this, because they've literally never met a progressive Christian. They don't know that that exists. A. B, for about 30, 40 years now, Republicans have done more publicly saying, we own the Bible, we own faith, this is ours.
Right.
And the era when the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, which had foundations in faith, were perceived that way or widely known, that has in some ways faded. I'll never forget campaigning with Sherrod. Senator Brown hosts a prayer group in his hideaway that's put on by Faith in Politics, and that's probably something he wouldn't want me to talk about very much. But I'm campaigning with him in Ohio. I'm a big Sherrod Brown fan. I think he's a great human being. And he went, how about a round of applause for Sherrod? And it's really clear if you spend any time with him that his progressive values are deeply rooted in his faith. Yeah. But so I introduced him. We were at 3 events together in the Youngstown area. And I introduced him clearly to a room full of 150, 200 people who were his supporters and had known him for years. And I talked about how I sort of knew him as a colleague. But once I was in this weekly prayer group meeting in his hideaway is when I really got to know him. Half the people in the room go. And so the second time I do the introduction, I give a little more explanation about how progressive it is, how welcoming it is, how there's a Buddhist, how there's a, right? And that we do breathing exercises and there's readings. But I go through it and I say, this is a senator you need to know acts based on his convictions and his heart. And it's a big heart and they're deep convictions. And the third speech, he's the one who started by saying, before Chris says this, I have a confession for all of you. I have a prayer group that meets in my hideaway. It is hard for us to talk about because every one of us have gotten blowback or criticism or negative responses from folks who feel that someone who is elected needs to be clear that it is their intention, their desire, their commitment to be as supportive and welcoming of those who are humanists, who have no faith, who are opposed to organized religion, as we are to co-religionists, as we are to those of other faiths. And so I try to simultaneously, particularly when I'm home in Delaware, make it clear to folks that I think you need to know where I'm coming from and what informs my core values, but I recognize I'm flawed and not in any way perfect, and this is just giving you a sense of my frame of reference, but it is my job as a senator to be available to and advocate for and embrace people who come at public life from a wide range of faith views, or those who are humanists, or who come at it from an ethical perspective, because that's what religious freedom means in our society.
And given what religion does or doesn't do, people reasonably conclude the answer to bad faith is no faith at all.
Correct.
And we're saying, my classes, this comes up all the time, the answer to bad faith, the answer to bad religion, let's call it that, is good faith, better faith. So how do we have that conversation that you've been having for a long time? You mentioned the word calling that began to arise during all this time. So how did your calling, growing sense of calling, your faith influence your decision after law school to go into public service and eventually run for the Senate? Did you pray over it? Did you have spiritual advisors? How did your calling present itself?
So I, again, too long a story for the amount of time we have, perhaps. It's almost like I was avoiding. I have a stepmother who told me twice that she was praying that I would lose an election so that I would accept my calling to the pulpit, because I wasn't fulfilling my call to ministry in my current role. Mm-hmm. I've had a very wide range of friends, including you, of course, that have prodded or pushed or challenged or called me in different ways to discern what it is I'm meant to do. I spent a number of years preaching supply, which for Presbyterians means when there's a pastor who's on vacation or who has a family emergency or something, you just go preach. And I've preached probably half the churches in Delaware in my denomination and a half dozen others.
Wow.
I love preaching. I find it it is the most spiritually challenging and rewarding experience I've had in life, other than being a parent. And I've performed a dozen weddings, and I do weddings only with a couple that will meet with me for at least 10 to 12 hours and go through 4 formation sessions, and then we work on a service. And I thought seriously about taking a pulpit ministry and going ordination track. But I'll also, in my denomination, you have to be able to read the Torah in Hebrew, and you have to be able to read the New Testament in Greek, and pass 6-hour exams in both. And I was at a point in div school and law school where I was working in a homeless shelter and engaged in a homeless ministry as a student pastor. And I looked at how much more study that involved, and I just didn't have the passion for it. And it was also really hard. And I remember thinking, you're just not serious enough. You're just not serious enough to belong in the pulpit. And I had some bad experiences where I was overextended and trying to do too much. And I delivered a sermon that was really not my best, not good. And I had an experience counseling someone that really wasn't. And I realized that I either needed to fully commit my whole heart and whole self to nothing but pulpit ministry, or if I was going to continue in community service and politics and business, I needed to be comfortable doing that. And it was like this.
Yeah.
Took a couple years. At the end of the day, my life path was only set when I had a chance to meet and marry my now wife. And literally the day I met her, my mother said to me, "How come you don't bring home any nice girls?" I'm 30 at this point. I'm working in New York. I'm working for the I Have a Dream Foundation. And I'm running a national AmeriCorps program. And for those of you who have mothers who say things like this, she literally says to me, "How come you don't bring home any nice girls?" I said, "Oh, mother, stop. Leave me alone. It's just get off my case. It's not right." She says, "Well, what about this thing you're doing today, this AmeriCorps thing, this conference?" I said, "Oh, Mom, I won't possibly meet anybody. It's just stop it." She goes, "As God is my witness, he will put before you today the girl of your dreams if you will but humble yourself and pray to him." It's like, oh, stop it. That's just ridiculous. Spent the whole drive down to the conference going. I met my wife that day. So your mothers are right. And my wife is an incredible partner.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so you know something about Joy. So do I.
And Joy's here, right there. David Beckman's here, bread for the world over there, too. I would say, though, also, that ministry shouldn't be defined by a clerical role. And some would say, I would say, that your work in the Senate is all that it is about politics and representing people. But the way you do it is also your own kind of ministry. You can have a ministry even in Congress or the Senate. I've seen you do that.
So
You have that.
my favorite professor in Div School was Sister Margaret Farley, who's an
yeah.
ethicist, very well-regarded ethicist.
Yeah.
And when I had a chance to go back and talk to her about my current role, I told her I'm not really serving in the Senate, that I'm engaging in an extended field practicum, and that I look forward to going back and someday writing with her all the case studies that I've been involved in and exposed to. So.
Well, in the Senate, though, you said religion has played a positive role, and one way it has is weekly bipartisan prayer breakfast. Senators have a prayer breakfast, and I know sometimes that means even very early train from Delaware to make the prayer breakfast. And you said this, it's awfully hard to throw a punch at someone, at least rhetorically,
Yes.
on the floor of the Senate when you've held hands with them in prayer in the morning. So tell us how that experience of praying with senators with whom you disagree, some of whom are now helping to lead a white Christian nationalist movement that requires not reconciliation but resistance. When it's time to save our democracy, how does praying with Republicans help?
So, we talked earlier about my relationship with James, with Senator Langford of Oklahoma. James and I were co-chairs of the weekly prayer breakfast for One Congress. On the night of January 6th, which I'll never forget, James was the last senator to rise in opposition and to begin debate on a motion when the Capitol Police came through and pulled us all out because the rioters were right outside the door. Right. And I was glaring at James with just unalloyed anger as he was making that motion. And after we were evacuated to another place, and I got on the phone with Schumer about what are we doing in Path Forward. He said, you need to go talk to. Thank you, Chuck. And I went and had a long heart-to-heart with several of my colleagues. Mm-hmm. In some cases, it made a difference. In some cases, it didn't. Mm-hmm. But he and I had a long sit-down about 2 a.m. after it was all over. When we finally got back into the chamber, he was the first senator to stand up and say, given the events of the evening, I withdraw my motion. And I've been to Tulsa, Oklahoma as his guest for the centennial of the race massacre. He's been to Wilmington as my guest to speak at our prayer breakfast in Delaware. We have learned to respect each other and to care about each other's families and to make the Senate a more livable place by our relationship to each other, even though he has political views and positions that he and I disagree on a lot. Yeah, it's sort of a running joke that we walk in Monday morning and go like this, no matter what we vote like that. And then I'm like, so how's your mom? You know what I mean? There are some senators with whom I genuinely struggle to find any grounds for reconciliation. But if you're willing to come and sit down and participate in prayer and hymns and stuff, and the deal is every one of us stands up at some point and spends 20 minutes talking to the small group, a dozen, sometimes 20. Senators are very open in this setting. We don't repeat what is said.
Yeah.
It is the only time where there's no press, there's no staff, there's no lobbyists, it's just us in a room. And the ones who aren't interested in a relationship don't come back. And the ones who are there eventually have become some of my best friends in the Senate. Johnny Isaacson, I got to know through the prayer breakfast. And there's also folks who stand up and talk and share things about their life and their values and their childhood. Orrin Hatch, Mike Lee, John Barrasso, who I never would have gotten to know, but for getting myself on a 5:30 a.m. train, coming down from Delaware, and being there listening to them. The first time I spoke at the prayer breakfast, I spoke about my father's ministry with Paul, who escaped from our house, and what it was like going through the experience of seeing Paul as a friend, as someone who I liked, and then seeing the police and our neighbors and the community outraged that we had been harboring this murderer, and that tension and the risks my father took. And at the end of my speaking, a senator, a Republican, comes up with tears in his eyes and asks me to forgive him. And I said, why? And he said, because I didn't know anything about you. I just knew what I heard from Rush Limbaugh. And I thought you were a bearded Marxist. And I was praying for your defeat in the election. And now that I've heard you, I realize you're a good person. If you're willing to be open to each other, with almost all of my colleagues, you can find a way to relationship and towards working together.
So relationship and common faith can break through some of the political barriers.
Look, almost every senator I know wants to get things done. And there's a big challenge with getting things done today because of the lack of trust. And the lack of trust is largely because we spend no time together.
Right.
We fly in Monday night, we fly out Thursday afternoon, and our families don't get to know each other, and we don't spend any time the way, 50 years ago, senators all lived here. They raised their kids together.
Right.
This is one of the places. Traveling together overseas, working out in the gym, and this prayer breakfast are the three places where I actually am able to get time together with spouses or individually or in a place that you're vulnerable and willing to be humans.
Spaces that we often don't have.
Exactly.
Yeah. You had a moment, though, a tough prayer breakfast moment. You're the co-chair, and former President Donald Trump is speaking that day at the prayer breakfast.
Oh, yeah.
And you had to decide what to say before his remarks. Take us through that very tough moment, how you decide what to say, and it was shortly after he instituted his ban on immigrants coming from Muslim countries. How do you deal with a moment like that?
So Max Finberg is a dear friend of mine, a Howard Divinity School graduate, and just a great guy, and a hunger warrior who's done a lot of good.
Friend of mine too, yeah.
And Tim Kaine, my dear friend Tim Kaine, when he went off to run for vice president, he came to visit caucus, see you guys, And I said as he was walking out the door, hey, if there's anything I can ever do. Right. So he calls me from the car. He's down in Florida campaigning. It's like 2 weeks before the election. He goes, Chris, I'm the co-chair of the prayer breakfast. I said, yeah. He goes, I don't have the time to deal with it, and I need you to take that over. And I literally said, oh, Hillary's going to give a great speech at the prayer breakfast. Don't worry about it. This will be great. The election happens. A week later, I called Tim, like, hey, by the way, tag. He goes, oh no, you said you'd do it. So it's 3 weeks after the election, and John Bozeman and I go to Trump Tower. And that's a long story.
Yeah, I bet.
And that was my first in-person experience with our former president and his spiritual advisors. And it so, wow. So I told you earlier about my mother's role in welcoming a refugee family. Well, my mother is one wonderful, persistent, forceful personality. And she had read in the Delaware paper that Delaware had not welcomed a single Syrian refugee family. So she called me up. She said, what are you doing about this? So our governor, Jack Markell, and Jewish Family Services, and my home church, Red Clay Creek Presbyterian, and Masjid al-Ibrahim, our largest mosque, partnered to provide a welcome to a Syrian refugee family. And they'd met in a refugee camp. They were from the neighborhood that had been hit by poison gas. And there'd been this long, and they finally got clearance. They'd finally had plane tickets. They had a baby girl, and they were about to come to the United States. And he issued that Muslim ban. And so I know that I'm going to be on the stage with the, oh, this is, yeah. 3 days before the prayer breakfast, Mike Pence shows up in my office, Vice President Pence. And he says, Senator, President Trump would like to travel with you. And I said, what? And he said, we've had our first combat death of this administration, and the remains will be received at Dover Air Force Base. And as you know, this is, and I went, oh, of course. All right, absolutely, sir. I will do that. I will do that. So I had just had the experience of standing at the flight line alongside our president as a flag-draped coffin came out the back of a C-17. And there is nothing to prepare you for the sound a widow makes and a daughter makes when they first confront the reality that their loved ones died in combat and has been returned in a box. And that was an experience that I had just had with the president. And I was conscious, as I had hoped he was, of the weight of the office. I had seen President Obama also go through that experience at Dover Air Force Base, where you first feel it's your job as president or as the home state senator to go visit with a family that is really grieving and really upset and often very difficult. So I had just had that experience. I'm seated at the front. The president's right over there. I am upset about the Muslim ban. The king of Jordan, lineal descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, keeper of the holy sites, was seated there in the audience, had come despite this, and had had difficulty getting into our country because of this. So there's a break in the program, and I get up and I walk over and I say to the president, Mr. President, and he looks up and I said, I'm Senator Coons of Delaware. Yes, I remember. And I said, I need to talk to you privately for a moment, sir. So I'll save you the details. I just said that it was important to me as a matter of my faith to share with him that I disagreed with the Muslim ban and I thought it was the wrong thing to do. And I thought it put us at risk of distance from close and trusted partners, that it violated the very spirit of the prayer breakfast, which was to welcome people not as a celebration of Christianity, but as a celebration of prayer and of the message of Jesus, recognized by a wide range of faiths as a prophet or a wise man or an important figure, and that I urged him to reconsider, and he disagreed. And I then said, Mr. President, I feel called to pray for you today, if I could. This is not and I said, I'm not making any political statement. I just feel like I need to pray for our nation. He said, fine, whatever. And so after he spoke, I stood up and briefly talked about my father and my father's prison ministry and how he was willing to take a risk that lots of folks in our community thought was unwise. And I asked President Trump if he'd stand up, and Senator Bozeman and I put our hands on his shoulder and simply prayed for his wisdom, that he could be a good leader for our nation and that he would open his heart to others. My father died that night. I never got to speak with him again, but I cannot imagine a better witness. And when I faced some sharp criticism for how could you do that, this was very early in President Trump's presidency, I said to a number of folks, what part of pray for your enemies did you not understand? So.
That's a moment where faith has to take shape and take heart in your heart at the moment, and you reached out to him.
And I owe that all to Max, because I didn't think of that. That was Max Finberg saying, trust in the power of prayer when you have no other answer.
Yep. Be thinking of some questions you'd like to ask, as we're going to come to you in a few moments. But I want to ask you, with your busy schedule, you've got to run off tonight afterwards for something else, and an important job, how do you stay spiritually centered, as they say?
You're presuming I'm spiritually centered.
I'm presuming that you want to be and try to be. in the middle of all that, how do you, I know it's important to you because you've written about this, how do you stay humble in a place here in Washington, D.C., where humility is not always seen as a virtue? And you and I both know the Micah 6:8 text. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God?
Amen. Yeah, Trinity and I were talking about that exact verse in the car on the way over.
Mm-hmm.
I read scripture every morning. I try. I do my best. It's almost every morning. I have a great congregation in Wilmington, First and Central Presbyterian, that I now go to. Red Clay's quite a distance from my home, and it's a progressive, welcoming church that has a real focus on mission, and where all members of my family are welcome. I try to find some brief moments of calm here and there in the din and the craziness of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I also, one of the challenges of the job I'm in, and I talk about this with other senators, if you're a contributor, if you're a chairman of a committee, if you're writing legislation, it is very easy to feel like you and you alone are the person who can solve X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Because I'm chairman of the subcommittee that funds all foreign aid, many in my caucus look to me to deliver on the $9 billion humanitarian aid request the president has sent up, and to be the one making the arguments. And thus, the sense I occasionally have that if I fail, if this doesn't happen, if literally millions of children starve as a result, it's all my fault. So given how much I have tried to do and failed to do in the Senate, humility is easy. Being humble is the easy part.
My.
Forgiving,
Yeah.
accepting that I am forgiven, and feeling like it's okay to keep trying and it's okay to keep at it. That's the hard part, and that's where faith comes in, for me personally.
So humility is hard in Washington, D.C., but if you're honest about what you're able to do and not do, humility comes easy.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Okay. All right, we're going to take some questions. If I'm going to go for students first, if you could just tell us who your name.
You're a student.
Your major. You're a student, right? We'll get to you. Name, major, what you're sitting here, and ask a question of Senator Coons. Is there a microphone? There she is. Okay. This is Kathleen Bonnet, who's a member of our team, a colleague of ours. So who has a hand? Okay, right here. Right here is a hand.
Hi, my name is Tomas Buccini from Delaware, and I'm studying business here at Georgetown. And Senator, I wanted to ask you, one of my favorite aspects about Georgetown University is the liberal arts education, where we have to take many classes, liberal arts classes, such as philosophy. And in this philosophy class, I recently read Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment essay, where he argues that humans need to seek spiritual advice, not from spiritual advisors, but within themselves. And so this essay, coupled with 10 years of Quaker education, have influenced me to reflect on my own faith and my relationship with God. And so I just wanted to ask you, what role do you personally think educational institutions should play in the development of their students' faith?
Great question.
Fabulous. Could some of the faculty all do a big, you guys are on the right track here if you've got students asking questions like that. Tomas, if I read that essay by Immanuel Kant, I do not remember it. And your citation of it is delightful and challenging. Look, particularly for a Catholic institution, I think it's central. As you know, I've twin boys. One went to Notre Dame, one went to Penn. Penn was founded as a Quaker institution, Notre Dame as a Catholic institution. I went to Amherst College, which at the time was actually a training school for pastors, for ministers, when it was first formed, as were all colleges at that point. I think the spiritual formation of students is essential to their education, to their ability to live full and meaningful lives. But how strongly the university as an institution shapes it, how much they require how much of the time and effort and energy of the faculty and the campus is dedicated to that, I think is a matter for each institution's traditions, culture, and resources. But having reflected on my 3 children and where they went, where I went, where my wife went, I think institutions that have a rich sense of a faith tradition and provide a wide range of opportunities for students to reflect on what they are called to be and who they are meant to be are more successful at education. Let me put it differently. I believe we're created, and I believe that we are created to have a relationship with our Creator, and to go through higher education and not contemplate or wrestle with that question. Are we created or not? Is this all accident or is it purposeful? Are we creatures or are we creations? And then what does that mean about how we relate to each other? And then what's that mean for me about how I conduct myself and how I relate to the people I'm blessed to work with and how I see the world? Like, how can you be educated and not wrestle with that question, is my view. And so an institution of higher learning that doesn't wrestle with that question and doesn't support and facilitate wrestling with that question is a trade school, is providing you with the mechanical skills to be successful in a career. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not a university. That's not preparing you for a rich and full and meaningful life. So I think I don't know if I answered your question, Tomas, but you're on the right track, and so is a university that welcomes and cherishes students who ask questions like that.
And creations in relation to other creations is also the only way to talk to senators on the other side of the aisle. That kind of spiritual underpinning is the only way to break through the partisan gridlock that we see. Okay, I have a quick question here, and then right here, you're next in front.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for being here. You mentioned that senators don't seem to spend a lot of time together, and that's very helpful because I'm actually writing a final paper on congressional reforms. So I'm curious, what changes can be made to build back that trust and for members to spend more time with each other, which would hopefully help things become more productive?
So there's a committee in the House in the last Congress that you may well be quite familiar with that really looked at the question of structural reforms. In the Senate, as I've talked to now retired senior senators about what changed, how did this get different? There's a lot of things that would need to change to make our institution healthier. But a simple one is to simply stop having only partisan caucus meetings and lunches Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and to have a schedule that allows for even occasional bipartisan lunches. My dear friend Johnny Isaacson developed a tradition over a decade of having a barbecue pit crew drive up from Marietta, Georgia, smoke and slice and bake and cook for 2 days, and then serve a barbecue lunch to the entire Senate. As Johnny took ill with Parkinson's, he asked if I'd make sure that continued. And we're still doing it now several years later. That is the one lunch the entire year now. Used to be daily, where all the senators come and sit down with no agenda and just talk to each other. So frankly, I have pressed both leaders of both caucuses on the value of our doing more of this. And each of them says they'd love to, but it isn't happening. Senators need to take responsibility themselves for making the effort, taking the initiative. 3 weeks ago, I was on Notre Dame campus with Todd Young, a Republican senator from Indiana. I no longer have a reason to be at Notre Dame other than I love the place. But spending a couple of hours with Todd in his home state on a campus in a home state institution was an investment I was thrilled to make. And it's only by doing things like that that it'll get better. And when our leaders see that the members value those relationships is when the schedule will change to incorporate it more.
Now, in other words, investments in other people as opposed to just fighting and beating other people. It's an important word. A question right here down in front. Yep.
I want to first thank you for being here, especially in the context of this conversation. Thank you for bringing the stories and the experiences that you have. I think it's really an important perspective for especially us young people to hear as we're going through university and sort of finding ourselves in our own journeys. And I was especially moved by the importance of sort of the conversations that you've had with your colleagues, and holding yourself open to conversations across the aisle with people that you don't ideologically agree with. And it strikes me as very important, especially in like a university setting, to make sure that we are holding ourselves open to those conversations as well. And so what advice would you give us as students, as people who are encountering a vast variety of different perspectives on a daily basis? What sort of advice would you give us for making sure that we're holding ourselves open to sort of experiencing all of those different perspectives?
I have two very shallow and not particularly responsive answers, so let's see if I deserve that question. First is put these things down. Turn them off, put them down. Like, put the tools down. I think these are profoundly divisive. Speaking for myself, I spend too much time doom scrolling, I think that's the term, looking at stuff that is just not healthy and not constructive and presents two-dimensional caricatures of other public figures and in particular other politicians. And it does something to relationship to only communicate through text and to only see people through social media, first. Second, I think spending time with people is a challenge and an opportunity and ultimately a blessing. And if you aren't spending time with people from significantly different views and backgrounds and just listening more than you're talking, you may not be being fully open to others' perspectives. Last, one of the newly popular phrases is crazy. I hear all the time. I mean, every day. I can't go an hour without being in a conversation, might just be the Senate, where someone is described as, or some policy position is described as, well, that's just crazy. So-and-so senator from such and such a state, well, we all know he's crazy. Such and such a president, well, that's just crazy. What does that really mean? What are we really saying? In an institution that is supposed to be about compromise, to be crazy is to be someone with whom you cannot reason. That's the definition. It's also disrespectful to people struggling with mental health challenges, bluntly. So just a test for yourself. If you find yourself routinely dismissing someone else as crazy in your class or in your social group or in your... Maybe what you mean is they have a different view, they have different ideas, they have different priorities, they're coloring outside the lines, they don't see the same guardrails I do. I have been struggling to find 100 synonyms for crazy so that I could describe some of my colleagues as something other than crazy. But it has been an interesting self-discipline for me to recognize that if I am describing as crazy one of my colleagues, that means I've given up on dealing with them. Do I have time for a brief story?
Sure.
So the last time I spoke at prayer breakfast, I'm preparing, and I think I know what I'm talking about. I'm delivering a message about those people. Right? And as I'm reflecting on the scripture passage I'm working with, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that I have said with some pride in several settings that there are 6 senators with whom I have not spoken one word since January 6th. One in particular, who I called for his resignation the next day, and we have not spoken since. And I'm supposed to be talking about reconciliation and humility. And one of those 6 is going to be there the next morning, and I know it. And I spent a long time thinking, how can I possibly honestly say that I'm committed to reconciliation and to working together and literally not say one word and be kind of proud of it to these 6? So I changed what I'm saying the next morning. And Senator Marshall of Kansas was in the room. And I say, Roger, I have not spoken to you one word since January 6th. I apologize. I would prefer to be reconciled to you if I can, but that requires a conversation for the two of us. And we're doing okay. But being clear about your own, the ways in which you're holding grudges and refusing to give space to other people's perspectives. I spend all day, every day with people who I really disagree with and whose conduct I really disapprove of. And they feel the same way about me. But if we're going to avoid a civil war, if we're going to actually have an institution that is built on listening to each other and moving ahead, then some of us have to be willing to put down the tools. Mm-hmm. Did I answer your question at all?
I promised you, so very brief.
Okay. Mark Hetfield, I'm an executive MBA student here at Georgetown, my third Georgetown degree, but I'm also the head of HIAS, which is the Jewish community's refugee agency. We partner with Jewish Family Service in Wilmington.
In Delaware.
In Delaware. And
it was through HIAS that the family I was talking about came to be in Delaware.
Yes, thank you.
We give them a round of applause
Thank you.
for amazing work in refugee resettlement.
And you started by talking about your family's experience resettling the Vietnamese refugee. And when I started my work in this field, refugees were a bipartisan issue. Yeah. Now you're working hard with Senator Klobuchar on getting the Afghan Adjustment Act passed, and it's been a struggle. Like, how can we change back to making welcoming refugees a bipartisan issue? Because so much of that work is faith-based.
Good question.
That's a huge, thank you. In fact, Senator Klobuchar had me out to Minneapolis once, and I got to talk to the community of churches and synagogues and mosques and people of goodwill in Minneapolis who have welcomed refugees for resettlement. There's truly remarkable. It weighs on me that this was truly bipartisan and has largely lost that. Look, we are in the middle of a very difficult time for the United States, for our spirit of civic commitment to each other, to service, to the world, to being a nation welcoming others. And we are in the very middle of fighting over asylum. And what does asylum mean? How are we going to welcome people who deserve asylum in this country? This is a country that you know better than anybody. I mean, that has this incredible tradition of welcoming people fleeing persecution. And yet that's not just not bipartisan, that is a partisan issue today. Mm-hmm. Look, I hope that we will move past a period of intolerance. I, on some level, think Christian nationalism has contributed in a really harmful way to a sense of America as having an alignment between certain faith traditions and ethnic traditions and identity traditions that are unwelcoming of others in ways that I find hard, that I reject. I think we're going to require a spiritual awakening in this country that moves us in a different direction, that moves us towards each other. Jose Andres is fond of saying, longer tables, building bridges, not walls. But we have a significant population in the United States that are angry, that feel disconnected, that accept the argument that the stranger and the foreigner and the alien is the cause of their problems in life, and who are unwelcoming. And this political shift has happened throughout the world. The election in the Netherlands just last week was a striking reminder that Islamophobia and xenophobia are successful electoral tools. So I am not giving you an inspiring and positive answer, but I'm telling you that I view the Torah righteousness of welcoming the stranger among you is a foundational value of this nation. And if we cannot find our way back to it, we cannot find our way forward.
So final question for you for them, okay? A recent survey, Harvard Institute of Politics, says 2/3 of likely voters between the ages of 18 and 29 believe American democracy is in trouble or failed. What would you say to young people like here tonight who are thinking about pursuing a career in politics at such a time as this?
We need you more than ever. American democracy is genuinely in trouble. If you answered that survey saying, I think American democracy is in trouble, your reality testing gear is in fine working order. We are really having trouble as a country respecting each other, hearing each other. Our conduct at home and abroad raises a lot of moral challenges, and finding a path forward has become fraught and difficult. I have an ancestor who served in the Civil War, who commanded troops and fought in a dozen battles from Gettysburg to Antietam to Lookout Mountain. And I was raised in a family that recognized that that didn't happen suddenly, that it took generations to get to the point where physical assaults by senators on each other on the floor and the near outbreak of war happened over and over and over. But it was over a fundamental flaw in the very fabric of America, the original sin of slavery that had to be erased from our nation, or we would not deserve to continue as a nation. It is my hope that some people listening will decide that being engaged in the work of democracy, whether that's in elected role or just in your neighborhood, just through civic organizations, just through how you treat others in your hallway or your dorm or your class, is worth your time. I have visited, lived in, and worked with a dozen countries just destroyed by conflict, from Liberia to, we don't need the list. Democracy is genuinely fragile. The United States is in many ways a source of inspiration for a lot of human rights activists and advocates, for folks who believe in democracy around the world, although we have our warts and faults and flaws. January 6th was a day that echoed throughout the world. And the simple choice between violence as a tool of politics and humility, listening, reconciliation, and consensus as a tool of politics is a choice. And the United States will only continue as a democracy if enough people make the choice that they're willing to invest their heart, their time, and their effort in hearing and respecting people of different perspectives, faiths, and traditions, and say, I embrace you and respect you as my fellow American, as a person who is also here in this country. However you came here and whoever you are, I want you to be a part of this community going forward. We need you today for that work more than ever.
We have heard a political leader tonight who tries every day to answer to a higher calling. Let's show our appreciation for them. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and know that you're not alone every day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Okay, great.